Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thanks for spending some time with us today. If you enjoy our conversations, make sure you never miss an interview by subscribing to the B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, b'rith.org, to learn more about our work across the globe. Few know what it's like to grow up Jewish in Lebanon, especially in the last 50 years. But that's exactly what Dr. Edy Cohen did, hiding his Zionism and his love for Israel the entire time until he and his family were forced to flee dangerous anti-Semitism. Today, Edy is a proud Mizrahi Jew who openly embraces his heritage and calls out anti-Semitism wherever it may come from. Edy is here to speak with us today about his life growing up in Lebanon as a Jew and his unique understanding and expertise of the issues that face the state of Israel, from Holocaust denial in the Arab world to the new opportunities brought about in the Middle East by the Abraham Accords. Dr. Edy Cohen is a historian, media commentator, and journalist specializing in inter-Arab relations, the Arab-Israeli conflict, Islamist terrorism, and the history of Jewish communities in the Arab world. He earned his doctorate at Bar-Ilan University and currently serves as a researcher at the Begin Sadat Center at Bar-Ilan University, the Center for Strategic Studies. As a native speaker and a writer of Arabic, Dr. Cohen regularly crosses media divides, communicating directly with Arab audiences and providing them with perspectives on Israel that they would otherwise not receive. Edy, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you being here today.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Well, let's start really at the beginning. Tell us a bit about your life growing up Jewish in Lebanon. I think that many of our viewers understand that there were large Jewish populations throughout the Arab world, but perhaps Lebanon may be one that is the least known. Most Israelis of your generation were born in Israel or emigrated to Israel quite young. So you certainly have a unique perspective as one of the last refugees from Arab lands. So tell us a bit about that.
Yes, as you said, Dan, I was born in Lebanon in 72. During the 20th century, there were approximately 1 million Jews in the Arab world. Also in Lebanon, there were a small community, like about 6,000 people living in Lebanon until 67. When the civil war launched in 75, approximately all the Jews flew and left Lebanon because of the war, because the civil war, the intern Lebanese civil war. My father didn't want to leave Lebanon. He said he is a proud Lebanese, and he stayed. He didn't want to leave Lebanon or to immigrate like all the Jewish and like many of Muslims and Christians that flew Lebanon because of the war. We stayed there until the 90s, and we were almost the last Jewish that stayed there in Beirut. Actually, we left in 91 Lebanon. We lived in France, and then we made Aliyah in 1995. We come to Israel in 1995. This is, in two sentences, until now there is some Jewish in Lebanon, but when we were there were a synagogue, there were a rabbi, there were a small community, like in Syria, in Libya, there were Jewish. We lived well, but being a Jew in the Arab world, it's very difficult. Myself, I didn't have good experience there because the Muslims always talk about Palestine. In the Christian there, they accused me that I killed Jesus Christ.
You lived there. It's interesting. You lived right through the entire Civil War.
Yes,
which I think the agreement to end the Civil War was what, in the Taif Agreement, I think it was called, 1994, 1995. What was it like growing up, let's say, going to a Christian school? You talked about having anti-Semitism from both sides, but on a day-to-day basis, what was it like? Did you have friends? What did your father do? What was his work? And how did the family manage during all of that time?
my father he worked in the import-export company in business, cloth import exportation. We lived well economically. We had friends, Christian friends, Muslim friends. But you know, when you are in school, children, it's not like my neighbors. We had good neighbors, Muslims and Christians. But I was 13 years old or 14. It's different when you are a child. Everyone bother you because you are different. You are Jew. Many friends told me that I'm from the Mossad, that I'm a spy, that I came to kill the Muslims. The Christians, others accuse me that my ancestors, my grandfather killed Jesus Christ. So it's a little bit difficult to live. Let's not forget, as I mentioned, it was a civil war, a continuing shelling, bombs. It's like what we see now in Ukraine. This is, it was a war, a bloody war. Christians killed the Muslims, Muslims killed the Christians, Druze, Palestinians, they were involved, also Israelis. At a certain point in 82, there was an Israeli invasion to Lebanon. The Syrian troops were there. Lebanon were like Syria in 2 or 3 years ago. Many troops, many armies, an endless conflict there. It's a little bit hard to be a Lebanese, especially when you are a Jew in Lebanon. It's more difficult.
So when you left in 1995, there was no social media. There was internet, but there was no social media. And today, you have about 500,000 followers who follow your social media posts, your Facebook posts. What is it you think that you were writing or saying that has attracted this substantial following?
Well, first of all, my followers, 99% of my followers are from the Arab world. The Arab world want to know more about Israelis' perspective. They want to hear Israelis speaking. They want to know about Judaism. They are very curious, especially when someone like me speak their language. So they want to hear it in Arabic. They called me, I'm an Arab Jew. This is how they call me. And I give them the Israeli perspective. For example, they listen to their radios. In the Arab world, they don't believe their own media. So they believe more they believe me than their own media. This is all the Arab world. And sometimes I translate in 1 second when there is news, I can translate it in seconds and post it. The other media, it takes hours. So sometimes I give them the news. And yes, I have approximately 500,000 people, followers from the Arab world. I also have many interviews in their own media. I appear in the Al Jazeera, in BBC Arabic, Russian TV in Arabic. So I'm working not only in Twitter or in Facebook, they saw me also on their television, on their media, in their own home. So I'm a little bit famous and they know me better from their own media also.
Well, let's talk about the biggest news in terms of what we used to call the Arab-Israeli conflict. maybe we call it something a little bit different today. We certainly still have an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But let's talk about, in terms of the Arab world and Israel, the biggest news since the signing of the treaty with Egypt and the treaty with Jordan in the mid-1990s, of course, 18 months ago, the Abraham Accords, the normalization agreements with Gulf countries and Morocco. From what you can tell in the broader Arab world, now I'm not talking necessarily in the UAE, where Israelis are coming and going and signing agreements and so forth, in Bahrain and the Emirates and Morocco. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that in terms of the recent signing of defense accords between Israel and Bahrain and Israel and Morocco. But in the Arab world, over the last 18 months, broadly speaking, what are people hearing about the Abraham Accords, which are monumental, is a monumental development in the course of history over the last 75 years?
Yes, of course. Now, because or thanks to the Abraham Accords, there's no, as you said, there's no Arab-Israeli conflict. The conflict now is Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The Arab world now understood that there is no dispute between Israel and Saudi Arabia. There's no rivalities, there's no war. There has never been a war between the Israeli state and UAE and Bahrain. It's at the contrary, we share the same enemy. The same enemy is Iran, the Ayatollah Iran. They will not say it publicly. They are afraid, especially the Gulf countries. But they told me, I flew to last August to Dubai. I was 1 week in Dubai, and they told me we share a common enemy. We cannot say it publicly, but we are closer to you than to the Iranian. So they need us. They don't need us to protect them. No, some people think that Israel will send F-35 to attack the Houthis or to attack Iran and to protect the UAE. No, there are many American bases in the Gulf, British ones, French also in Kuwait. We will not protect as many things, but they need relationship. They need relation. They have now, it's worse, the relation between UAE, between the Gulf country and the Biden administration is changed. Before the Trump administration, there were good relationship between the Gulf states and with Trump administration. Now it's worse. I will not enter to this dispute between them. So these countries need us, need the Israeli, need the Jewish lobby in the world, and they need our technology. The Gulf countries need our technology. You didn't mention Sudan. Sudan also is intending to normalize with Israel. There are good ties. The Israelis were there, and the Sudanese VIP were here 2 weeks ago in Israel. So also the Sudanese need our economy, our technology. Finally, the Arab world, this is a weakness. The Abraham Accords did what Cairo, Camp David didn't do. We had an agreement or Camp David agreement with Egypt, and always the Palestinian issue it's close to this agreement. Now we are free. We made peace with Morocco, with the UAE, with Bahrain. It's not related to the Palestinian issue. This is what the great thing and the great victory for Israel.
Well, you mentioned technology. I think there's no question that that there are investors in that part of the world, they see and they value how the Israelis have built an economy around high tech, cutting edge. And I think, it's a good marriage, actually, between those countries and Israel. We talk about normalization. Normalization to me means people to people. You mentioned, for most of the period since the Egyptian peace treaty and the Jordanian treaty, there have been relations, and a lot of it relates to security. But what we've seen here over the last 18 months in terms of people to people is really a new dimension, which not only bears watching, but I think we need to encourage. Edy, I want to go to another area that you follow very closely. We've talked about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I want to talk about Holocaust denial. We're now living in a period globally, where we have Holocaust denial, Holocaust trivialization, Holocaust minimization. The further we get away from 1945, with the number of survivors now passing away, larger number passing away, of victims whose testimonies about suffering and the brutality inflicted upon them, that we're moving to a new phase. Now, the Palestinian dimension in all of this, in terms of Holocaust denial, at least over the last several decades, a lot of it has centered on Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, who is the president of the Palestinian Authority. Much has been written, and perhaps you can tell us more about his doctoral dissertation, which involved Holocaust minimization. We've also seen at the same time, in Iran, there was recently a General Assembly resolution on Holocaust denial that was adopted. 149 countries voted for it. And the Iranians got up to speak against it, saying that, Israel uses the Holocaust to advance its political aims and so forth. So that's another form, and the Iranians are among the biggest Holocaust deniers. So tell us a little about that and how that relates to contemporary anti-Semitism in the Arab world or in the Palestinian community.
Yes, unfortunately, in the all Arab worlds, the Holocaust study are not taught in the school, also in the university. Arab young people, young students, young pupils doesn't learn about the Holocaust. There are, in contrast, there are many conspiratorial theories about the Holocaust. As you said, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, the chairman of the PLO, wrote a book. This is a book, as if you can see it in Arabic, and all of it, it's full of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. There's few researchers in the world that study the Holocaust denial in the Arab world. I am maybe the only one or one of the fewest researchers that studied this phenomenon in the Arab world. There are many theories, many conspiracy. For example, the Arab thinks, as Mahmoud Abbas wrote his PhD when he lived in Russia, that the Holocaust is a conspiracy, that Adolf Hitler and David Ben-Gurion cooperated together, so that the Jews are responsible for the Holocaust because they wanted to have a country, Israel. So this is one of the many theories. Another theory, the Arab claims that the European people, the European countries wanted to get rid of the Jews. So they asked Adolf Hitler to exterminate the Jews. Another theory that the Arabs claim that the Jewish brought virus, brought slavery in Europe, that the Jewish robbed the European economy. That's why Hitler decided to exterminate the Jews. Some of them, the Muslims, said that the Holocaust is a punishment from Allah because the Jewish didn't accept the Prophet Muhammad wanted that the Jewish converted to Islam. So the Jews refused, and that's why Allah punished the Jews during the 40. So there is full of Holocaust denial. When you accuse the Jewish being collaborated with the Hitler, this is also a sort of Holocaust denial, and you minimize, as you said, the Holocaust. There is a lot of admiration of Hitler personality in the Arab world. All the practice, I cannot say, but 90% of the Arab world admire Adolf Hitler. This is many read his book. You can find his book, download it, translate it into Arabic. In 1 second, you can download it to your PC. Many admire Adolf Hitler. This is that's why nothing changed.
I know. Also, I remember some years ago that the administrators in UNRWA were refusing to include lessons about the Holocaust in their curricula. I think that, you know, one of the effective ways of pushing back after decades of this is what we are beginning to see as a result of the Abraham Accords, because we're hearing that in the Emirates and Morocco, the new lessons about the Holocaust are being introduced. Now, it's going to take some time, of course, but this may be one way of beginning the pushback after decades of this Holocaust denial. And it's not only denial, it's the charge of manipulation of the Holocaust that's been leveled against the State of Israel and against its supporters. So I'm sure you're tracking that as well as a result of, at least over the last year and a half, of what's coming out of the Gulf and out of Morocco.
Yes, I personally gave a lecture, in a Zoom lecture with the think tank Moroccan Institute 1 month ago. But the problem is that in the school, they must teach it in the school, in the university, not make celebrate only once a year, like the Holocaust International Day in 27th of January. Their own school, also in UAE, also in Morocco, also in Bahrain, they must teach this Holocaust studies. But who will teach this? The professor that don't know very well about what truly happens. Some in the Arab world, they ignored. They said that there were no gas chambers during the Holocaust. They say there were only 1 million, maybe 1 million Jews that were exterminated, and not 6 million, because this is Jewish propaganda in order to manipulate the world. So the Arab world is full of Holocaust denial. You cannot imagine.
Yeah, the point about educating teachers, I guess that is the biggest challenge, where this has not been taught. And perhaps, over the coming years, there'll be an opportunity for educators, if the Accords continue to show the promise that they've shown, at least so far, that this is another people-to-people element, not the only one, but a very important one, bringing educators perhaps to Israel, to Yad Vashem, or to other places, to Israeli universities to study. But you're right; it's a long look ahead. It's not going
Especially
to
in the
happen.
Palestinian Authority, please let me, in the Palestinian Authority, there was one prof that took his student to visit, took his Palestinian students to visit concentration camps in Auschwitz. When he returned, they almost killed him because this is like treason. We cannot, the Palestinian narrative, you cannot sympathize with the Jew. During the last 5 years, when I read the Palestinian media, you can see that they accuse us of being Nazis. The Gaza is like a concentration camp. So we are so-called the new Nazis. So we have a long past, especially with the Palestinians, our neighbors.
Yeah, and it's not only them. We're also getting it from NGOs, from many NGOs outside the Middle East, who are making the same accusations. I want to bring this over to Iran for a second and tie it into the crisis in Ukraine. The talks in Vienna, the discussions about U.S. returning to the JCPOA. What do you think? Has the Ukraine crisis in any way affected the outcome of those talks in Vienna? What do you think?
I don't think so, because the Biden administration want a deal with any price. So maybe it will be late, but it will not affect this subject. No, I don't think there's a relation between this. The Iranian and the Biden administration wants a deal, and unfortunately, this deal will be bad for Israel.
And the Ukraine crisis itself, we've been reading over the last few days a lot about how the Ukraine crisis, which many outside of this region see as a crisis in Europe or as a crisis in transatlantic relations vis-a-vis Russia. What is the impact of Ukraine on the Middle East and on the Middle East heartland of which Israel is a part?
Well, this the difference between Israel and the Arab world. In the Arab world, they all fear from Putin, or they don't want to interfere. The Arab world, they saw what Putin have made in Syria. We saw what's happening in Ukraine, but let's not forget that the Russian artillery in the Russian planes killed hundreds of thousands of Syrian people in Syria. So the Arab people, the Arab leaders, they know that Putin is a very cruel person. That's why the UAE abstained in the United Nations last week when they wanted to, there was a veto, a Russian veto in the United Nations last week. The Arab leaders they fear Putin. They don't want to interfere. This is not our war, and that's what Israel should have done. But Israel is, we heard the Minister Lapid. The people of Israel sympathize with the Ukrainian. We can see it. What implications? No one knows. No one knows what application will be. We have the Russian military is in Syria. We have a big issue with the Hezbollah. We mentioned Iran. Iranians send daily arms to Hezbollah, and we want to prohibit them. We want to stop them. So the Israeli airplanes fly almost twice a week in the Syrian airspace, in the Syrian area, and the Russians are there. They know this. They know that we fight the Iranian presence there. They let us. But now there are implications. There will be implications about Israeli-Ukrainian fraternity.
Well, Edy, let's go back. Let's conclude with where we began, and that's with Lebanon. B'nai B'rith had an extensive network in the Arab world, in the Islamic world. At one time, B'nai B'rith was in Beirut, in Aleppo, Damascus, Cairo, Alexandria, even Khartoum at a certain point, Port Said.
Which year?
Prior to 1948, and we have in our archives some photographs from this period. And so we were we're an international organization, but as a result of going back to the Ottoman Empire at that point, and during let's say the French and British colonial period, we were extensively represented in the region. Now, you left in 1995. Tell me about, it's difficult now, but my guess is you would like to go back and not only see where you lived and where your father worked and where the community prayed, but also to engage at some point, hopefully, Lebanese. What do you see as the prospects for that? Because we know that Lebanon has severe economic difficulty. Hezbollah essentially runs Lebanon in the name of Iran. What do you see as the prospects for Lebanon? And tell us a little about how, once perhaps, hopefully, things change, you might go back.
Well, you can never forget the country that we were born. This is natural. I have also bad souvenirs, but also good souvenirs in this country. I was born there. I miss the weather there. I miss the water there. And believe it or not, I still have friends that I grew up with them. I can see them Facebook now. We can see Twitter and Facebook. So I have some friends. Part of them lives in the States, in the Canada. It's easier to speak with them. Of course, I cannot speak with my friend that live in Lebanon because there is a Lebanese law that prohibits every Lebanese to get in touch. Also in Twitter, also in Facebook, it's against the law to speak with Israelis. Yes, of course I miss Lebanon. Unfortunately, Lebanon is dominated by Hezbollah, but Hezbollah, it's 2 million people. So it's I'm very pessimist. Hezbollah is dominating Lebanon. Lebanon has collapsed, if I can use this word. The Lebanon country cut their ties with the Saudi, with the Arab, and they have more ties with the Iranian, with the Bashar Assad country. So Lebanon, it was the symbol of the West if you remember, during the 60s, the 70s, it was the Swiss of the Middle East. Now it's like an Iranian province. Now Lebanon has changed. Frankly, I would like to go there to see, of course, but not to live there. They didn't protect the Jews there. Speaking about the Abraham Accord, the only country that is building, Arab country, is building synagogue today in this century is the UAE. In every country, Arab countries, they demolish the synagogues. In Iraq, in Libya, in Yemen, in Syria. So in Lebanon, they didn't demolish. It's not the government. This is the Hezbollah, this anti-Semitism organization. I didn't mention in 85, my father, in 11 Lebanese Jews were kidnapped and killed by this terror organization. My father was among them. They killed them because they were Jews. So you cannot, it's not secure, this country. It was never secure, this country. Before 75, it was secure, but after the Civil War, it's not secure. And of course, these days, Lebanon is invaded by Iranian and Hezbollah in Syrian. So I don't think that we might come back one day. Lebanon has collapsed. It's no longer Lebanon. I said sadly.
Well, on that note, Edy, thanks again for joining us today. We really appreciate your sharing your unique perspective and optimistic outlook and pessimistic outlook, depending on the issue on the Middle East. It's been a real pleasure, and we hope you'll come back.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you.
Well, thanks again to Dr. Edy Cohen for his analysis of current events and opportunities in the Middle East post-Abraham Accords, and for sharing his experiences about growing up Jewish in Lebanon. If you enjoyed our conversation today, make sure you catch all of our programs by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel, liking us on Facebook, and following us on Twitter and Instagram. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. For my guest, Dr. Edy Cohen, and for B'nai B'rith, I'm Dan Mariaschin. See you again soon.